What I want to talk about here is off-axis animation. First of all, what is this off-axis animation? Well, we have a walk cycle here on a little guy, and that's, very nice and cute and simple. However, if we look at the grid here, what we can see is happening is that he's actually animated down a specific axis. If we grab his root controller here, and we're importantly looking at the parent axis method here, of course, then what we see, if we look at him from the front, is that he is, of course, coming straight down and along on his Z axis here. He's animating straight along the Z. Now, when you are keying walk cycles and stuff, there are various little moves that you put in, like little shifts left to right on the hips here. And in a situation like this, where we are animating straight down an axis, such as the Z axis, then that's very easy to do, just by manipulating the X channel here. We can see, of course, what this gives us in terms of our actual graph. We can see that the X curve is this nice, simple and reasonably symmetrical curve across the 0 line here. As, of course, the X position of the root is weaving back and forwards across, time and the cycle. His forward movement we see here on the Z, which is just this nice, run down. It gets ever lower and lower, or higher and higher, depending which way, the action is going, as he keeps moving forward in time. Any little rises and falls which we see here on the Y channel, they're just bouncing straight up and down, nice and simple. Now, however, imagine that we're performing, some similar sort of animation, a walk, but we're doing it across axes. So I'll just knock something in very simple here so as we can see the approximate effects and outcomes of this. So there he is across 30 frames, just moving here on the diagonal. Obviously, no real walk in here, but what we're seeing, of course, for the moment is that we have only got forward motion here on our character. However, when we look at the graph, we see that this forward motion is a combination of both X and Z position. This then gives us, a real little headache, as of course, as he's moving along, if he needs to dodge side to side like this, then that, side to side dodge that you would put in on the root or the hips or what have you, is also becoming a combination of the X and Z positions like this. Of course, just taken here in a basic way, you can see that it's, broadly working there. But of course, again, we look at the graphs and what we see is that both are having to do this funny little wiggle as they go along. Now, you can, of course, use the local axis manipulation method when your, character or any controller is turned off axis like this. That means that, when I want to actually start moving him left to right on his local X like this, I can do that very easily just operating this one handle. And I do get a perfectly planar movement, in line with his local rotation. But of course, graphs are always recorded, positions are always recorded in parent space. Therefore, no matter what I do, I'm always going to wind up with these, funny kind of channel crossovers. In one respect, it's not such a big deal, but of course the problem comes when you want to be able to, time things, and especially when you want to spline things, you've got to sort of try and keep the two in sync with one another. Otherwise, you wind up with the channels crossing over and the motion doing, something a bit weird during an in-between phase here, at the point where the channels are being interpolated between one frame and the other. And it's this simple fact of things being in parent space, and of course the way that motions are represented in graph, that makes cross-axis animation like this, or off-axis animation, such an unbelievable pain. It really can be horrible to try and get right and to try and tease your motions. So what can we do about it? How can we deal with it? In full honesty, there's no simple way or easy technique that you can use to get around these issues. There's no tool that you can use to reformat the graphs somehow. Most commonly, you'll be faced with this problem when a character is moving around a space. They're travelling in one direction for a bit, then they change and travel in another direction. You can try to make things easier for yourself by putting in a good dose of planning. Take careful note of where the character is going to move, this point to that point to the next point and so on, and try and line up the overall motion in space such that you can get as much of it as possible happening on axis, with smaller portions happening off axis. This will reduce the amount of work that you have to do when working in an off-axis piece of motion. Other times it's something of a staging issue, and whilst your character themselves is, quite happy to be animated on axis like this, what you really need them to do is to be placed off axis somewhere in space, either to link up with the motion of some other character or a piece of scenery or something like that. In this case, it's really simple to handle because, of course, all of this stuff that we're talking about has nothing to do with the world axis here represented by the grid. It has to do with the parent space of the character's controllers. Any character rig should have a master or global root item that is the parent of everything. As we see here on this guy, I move that root and the entire rig and animation is going with it. As such, if I do want him walking pretty much straight ahead, but going across the world axes, I can just rotate the global root here, and of course off he goes, still in a nice straight line. Of course, his parent axes are still all on axis. He is still moving forward only on his Z. He is still doing his little side-to-side shifts only on his X, or at least on his parent's local X, but he is still able to, of course, walk across the space in off-axis world relative sort of motion. It is also possible to bring in other tricks and tools along the way if you do need to change direction during some kind of motion. For instance, here I've got this little, walk action taking place on axis, nice straight line there. And further, if we take a peek in the rigging toolbox, you'll see that there's this make slide pivot tool. If you want to see the intricacies of this, go and have a look at the Rig It 2 playlist. There's an instructional video for it there. But this is a tool that lets you create a sliding, reparenting pivot for things. So I can come out to some frame where I'm going to be wanting him to start making a turn, probably somewhere around here, 66, and with the global root there selected, I can put a slide pivot on it. I can move that out to the actual point of pivoting there, and then over a few frames, let's say a single step here, I can give it a rotate, and you see, of course, what that's doing is shifting the global root around there, with the effect that it makes him, of course, turn this corner like that. So in this case, I'm happy to have him walking broadly straight. I just need a simple turn at some point for some reason. And so I can throw in a little rigging trick that helps me get around it, whilst of course maintaining the animation of all his controls on axis. Obviously, when you do that, you introduce little funny things, like you can see, of course, the foot here is sliding around. So you would need to work back into that and just, provide some sort of manual adjustments to get ready for that, and, try to tweak it and tween it and fix it up in some way so as it carries through better. But usually doing that is a lot less work than having to animate the entire main top parts of the rig, such as the root and the foot goals, in a true off-axis manner. There are also other in-rig ways of dealing with the issue, the simplest of which is the use of offsets. Again, this is a rig control issue. A rig either has the control or it doesn't, and you can choose to build rigs that have it, or indeed take rigs and modify them to put offsets in if you're wanting. What you see, for instance, here on this guy is you've got his main root control there, but an immediate child of that and parent of everything else is this, the main root offset. Whilst you can see, of course, that the main root here is in its parent space, Z pointing backwards there and X across, the main root offset's parent is the main root, and thus its parent space is nicely aligned to the rotation of the main root. As such, you can go along just performing very simple animation on your top level control items such as main route, IK goals, what have you, yes, you still wind up with this multi-channel movement here, but it only need be simple with very, very few keyframes. What you're then able to do, of course, is to put all of your little details, side-to-side dodging, or weaving back and forth on Zs, stuff like that, on the offset controller, as well as, of course, any additional rotation work, because, of course, your rotations are also aligned in the parent space here. So as you can see, there's a couple of ways to go around working with off-axis animation. Sadly, no one rule to work in every situation. And as I said before, the best way to deal with it is just to have a good plan ahead of time of where and when you're moving your character through what points of space. It's not always a huge issue, and you won't necessarily be encountering it all the time. But it is worth keeping in mind, because I can assure you from personal experience that if you just go around animating your character freestyle in space, then when you hit these off-axis movements, you'll find them an utter hell to have to deal with. And that's not something that we enjoy when producing animation. We want it to be enjoyable, we want it to be creative, we just want to have the control there to do something with, rather than having to fight as we go along every step of the way.